Carl Jung was a fascinating person, I think. You can read his biography, autobiography/biography, which is called Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which in many ways I think is an unfortunate book because it's usually the only book that people read that is more or less by Jung. And it is more popularly accessible, which is probably a good thing, but it's also, it's not as rigorous as his other books. And so the problem with someone like Jung is you kind of have to read him as much as you can in the original because interpreting him is not a very straightforward matter. He was a very visionary person, by which I mean he had an incredible visual imagination, and he used that a lot. He used it in his therapy practice. I believe that most of his therapy clients were high in trait openness. I have a lot of clients who are high in trait openness. They kind of seek me out because I'm high in trait openness, and they watch my videos and that sort of thing, and they're interested in what I'm doing. And many of them are astute dreamers and prolific dreamers. And many open people, in my experience, have archetypal dreams. Whereas people who are lower in openness, they either don't dream at all, or they don't remember their dreams as much, or they're not interested in them, and they're not interested in the mythological underpinnings of them. So I've taught psychology, roughly speaking, to many different types of people, including lawyers and physicians, and they tend to be higher in trait conscientiousness than in openness. And they're much more interested in the practical applications of psychology and maybe the big five theories than they are in the narrative underpinnings. And people say that when they went to Jung, they had Jungian dreams, but I don't, and then when they went to Freud, they had Freudian dreams, and I don't really believe that's exactly true. I think it was a matter of selection bias, a priori selection bias on the part of the people who were likely to go see either of those two. And so, but I've been struck by some clients in particular how unbelievably, continually they can generate deep archetypal dreams with a really coherent narrative structure. It's really phenomenal, and how revealing those dreams are. Problem with archetypal dreams is that they're not really personal, right? So if you're looking for a personal way out of a situation, an archetypal dream doesn't help you that much because it gives you the general pattern rather than a specific solution to your problem. But a good dream will do both at once. Anyways, Jung was an astute student of Freud's. We'll cover Freud next, although generally in personality courses the order is reversed. It's Freud first and then Jung because of the temporal order of their thought. But I think it's better to start with Jung because it's as if Freud excavated into the basement and then Jung excavated into many, many floors underneath the basement of the mind. And so if you're transitioning from an archaic understanding of archaic modes of thinking towards Freud, it's better to go through Jung because Jung is, I think Freudian theory is a subset of Jungian theory fundamentally, just like Newtonian physics is a subset of Einsteinian physics. And I think that Freud knew that even to some degree, although he was very much opposed to any sort of religious thinking, mythological religious thinking, I would say. He was a real 19th century materialist, and he didn't like the fact that Jung's work started to delve into religious themes in a manner that actually in some sense validated those themes. And so that's actually why they split. They split when Jung published a book called Symbols of Transformation. Jung was also a deep student of Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is kind of an Old Testament revelation poetry kind of book. It's a strange one, and I wouldn't recommend, if you want to read Nietzsche, that you start with that one, but most people do. But Jung did a seminar on Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is about, I've got this wrong, it's somewhere between 700 and 1100 pages long, and it only covers the first third of the book. And Thus Spake Zarathustra is actually quite a short book. And so, well, so you can imagine how much Jung had to know about Nietzsche to derive that many words out of that few words. And Nietzsche was an absolute genius. And Jung was actually trying to answer the question that Nietzsche posed fundamentally. Which is why, part of the reason why it's incorrect historically to consider him a Freudian. So Nietzsche basically stated, let's say explicitly, that scientific empiricism / rationalism had resulted in the death of the mythological tradition of the West, roughly speaking. That's Nietzsche's comment on the death of God. And in that comment, he also said that the fact that God was dead was going to produce tremendous ideational and social, historical upheavals that would result in the deaths of millions of people. That he didn't say all that in one place. It's spread between, part of it's in Will to Power, and I can't remember the source of the other one. some of it's referenced in Thus Spake Zarathustra. But Nietzsche believed that in order to overcome the collapse of traditional values with the idea, say, of God as its cornerstone, people would have to become creatures that could produce their own values as a replacement, that we would have to become capable of generating autonomous values. And Jung, but that's easier said than done, because trying to impose a set of values on yourself is very difficult, because you're not very cooperative. And you know that if you try to get yourself to do something that you don't want to do, or that's hard, you just won't do it. And so it's not like you can just invent your own values and then go along with that. That just doesn't work. And so what Jung and the Freudians did, Freud first, I would say, was to start looking into people's fantasies, autonomous fantasies, unconscious fantasies, to see if they could, and discovered that values bubbled up of their own accord into those fantasies. And you can imagine, for example, if you've become enamored of someone, that you might start fantasizing about them. And if you read off the fantasy, then you can tell what you're after and what you're up to. And so the motivational force composes the fantasy. And Freud was more interested in that in a personal sense. So insofar as your fantasies might reveal your personal history. So for example, if you have a burst of negative emotion in a clinical session, there'll be a fantasy that goes along with that, and an association of ideas that kind of manifest themselves of their own accord, and they're not necessarily coherent and logical. They're linked by emotion. That's the free association technique in Freudian psychology. And they also might manifest themselves in dreams and fantasies. And so Freud started doing the analysis of these spontaneous, let's call them fantasies, and Jung linked that more. Freud did this first with the Oedipal complex, but then Jung linked up spontaneous fantasies and dreams with mythology and fantasy across history. And of course, Piaget did the same thing from a completely different standpoint.